On April 12, 1861, the American Civil War officially began. Lasting 4 years until May 9, 1865, the Union, which comprised of American states, decided to stay loyal to the Federal Union, entered into a bloody war against the Confederacy, which was states voted to succeed. While some wars are started due to disagreements between two countries, or one country wanting to gain more land, the primary cause of the outbreak of the American Civil War was slavery, with the Union wanting to abolish the practice. More accurately, the Union was concerned by the economics of slavery, while the Confederacy were more interested in the individual state rights, renouncing their agreement with the other United States to establish a new nation. However, throughout all of the bloodshed, here are 7 facts from the American Civil War which you may not have known. Before I start, I'm Aidan. I talked Ethan into letting me out of the basement so I could do this video, but I've got to go straight back in once I'm done. Someone please send help, it's dark down there. Fact 1. The 1863 assassination attempt of President Lincoln. It's widely known that the 16th President of the United States was assassinated by the Confederate spy John Wilkes Booth on April 11, 1865 at Ford's Theatre. However, this was not the first attempt at taking his life. In August 1863, 2 years into his term as president, after a day of working in the White House, doing presidential things, while heading towards the Lincoln family's summer residence, a gunshot was heard by a private man at the gate. Shortly after, President Lincoln was clinging to his horse without his hat. Once reaching the homestead, President Lincoln explained that once the gunshot had gone off, that his horse had started galloping so fast that his hat fell off. Following this, 2 soldiers went out and retrieved his hat, which happened to have a bullet hole straight through it. I guess he was wrong about it being the horse's fault. It's not known who the assassin was, however, he asked for the incident to be kept from his wife as to not worry her, possibly showing for the first time in history that lying to your significant other was a good thing to do. Fact 2. Robert E. Lee's estate becoming a cemetery. As the war descended into Virginia, commander of the Confederate States Army, Robert E. Lee, alongside his wife Mary, fled their 1,100-acre Virginia estate, known as Arlington, overlooking Washington, D.C. At one point in 1863, the US government confiscated his estate due to a non-payment of $92.07 in taxes. Once this had happened, President Lincoln gave permission to the government for a cemetery to be built on the property, as well as a burial vault in the former rose garden of the former estate. President Lincoln's logic behind the decision was to make it, if Commander Lee ever decided to return to his former estate, then he would have to look at the graves which were now covering his land and see the carnage he had created through the Civil War. Following the end of the war in 1865, Robert and Mary supposedly looked quietly into reclaiming Arlington. However, nothing ever came about from this. In 1877, their eldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, sued the federal government for confiscating his family's estate illegally. The Supreme Court decided to agree with him and returned it back to him. Although after realising what could his family do with an estate covered in corpses, George Lee sold it back to the US government for $150,000. Fact 3. More men died in the Civil War than any other American conflict. It is estimated that over the 4 years that the American Civil War was occurring, that 625,000 men died. This is more Americans dead than the whole of World War I, World War II, the Korean War and Vietnam combined. At the time, 2% of the overall population of the United States died. It would be assumed that the most devastating killer of men would be the rifles being used by both sides of the war, and although this was the most devastating weapon, even more deadly was disease, causing roughly 2/3 of all deaths from the war. Typically, the population of the US was spread out and isolated. When the army started to amass in 1861, men were no longer protected, having to march shoulder to shoulder with each other, sleeping in the same tents without much airflow. The camps of both sides of the war were breeding grounds for diseases such as mumps and measles. It is estimated that 1 million Union soldiers contracted malaria over the 4 years of the war. Fact 4. The first modern war. When thinking about modern war, most people's first thought would be the 2 world wars due to the use of more modern weapons and tanks, or maybe even later. However, the American Civil War is considered by most historians to be the first ever modern war. The reason for this viewpoint is due to the fact that for the first time in human history, advanced warfare machinery and techniques were being deployed. Some of the advanced warfare that was being used were mines, rapid-fire weapons, railroads, ironclad ships, aerial observation, and also telecommunication through intelligence for both sides of the war. As well as this, it can be seen as the first ever true industrial war, this being a war in which a massive part of the war effort were the efforts of industry such as civilian factories, banks and transportation. Fact 5. Black Union soldiers protest overpay. One of the major viewpoints of the Union was to unite all aspects of the US and to end slavery. However, even with this being the viewpoint, there was still discrimination throughout soldiers in the army. It wasn't until 1863 when black men were allowed to join the Union Army and help fight for their own rights. However, at this point they were being paid a total of $10 per month, with a fee then being deducted of $3 for their clothing. White soldiers were being paid a minimum of $13 per month, not having to pay the clothes fee. However, the implications of this was that black Union soldiers were not allowing for this inequality to go on any further. In response, they decided to rebel and refuse their salaries for 18 months. As a result of this, with the backing of abolitionist congressmen, Congress decided to improve the situation in September 1864 to pay fair wages to black Union soldiers. Fact 6. Glowing wounds. On April 6th to April 7th, 1862, the Battle of Shiloh, also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, took place. Up until this point of the Civil War, this was the bloodiest and most lethal engagement of the conflict, with an estimated 3,480 deaths and 16,000 wounded spread across both sides of the battle. But a strange point of this battle was the strange event of soldiers having glow-in-the-dark wounds. Wounded soldiers would end up spending most of the battle lying in the mud waiting to be brought to doctors for help, where the glow-in-the-dark wounds were then discovered. Another strange thing is the fact that the wounds which were glowing seemed to heal better than the ones that were not. It wasn't until 2001 when 2 Maryland teenagers discovered the reason for this phenomenon taking place. Due to the soldiers lying in the mud and rain for 2 days, they became hypothermic, allowing for ideal conditions for a bioluminescent bacteria known as photohaplous luminescence to enter the wounds and in turn start to glow. Fact 7. 4 expensive years. Throughout the 4 years of the war, not only was the death toll extremely high compared to any conflict in modern history, it was also financially damaging for the United States. The estimated cost of the war in 1865 was a staggering $6.19 billion. If you take inflation into consideration now, that's $146 billion. Prior to the war starting, the US government was spending around $1 million a week. However, by the conclusion of the war, the federal government were having to spend around $3.5 million per day. Not only this, it is also estimated that the south of the US, which was the primary battlefield of the conflict, took a majority of the damage, with around $10 billion in property damage and 2/5 of the South's livestock destroyed. Thank you for watching this video on American Civil War facts. Thanks to this extra knowledge, my forehead is now even larger, nearly big enough to land a Boeing 747 on it. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and maybe even share a video with your mates. If you're feeling particularly forceful, maybe abduct them, put them in the boot of your car, and drive them to a secluded destination, where there's a basement similar to mine, and then force them to watch our content. Until next time I'm out of the basement, friends, goodbye.